It's my pleasure to be here. And I was thinking as I was coming in from home this morning, this is actually the 10th year that I've been privileged to meet with teachers attending the Institute. And I just think it's marvelous that you carve out a week of what I know is precious time to come in and spend time together. And I dare say, based on past experience, you will certainly learn more from the people with whom you're sitting than you will from most of the people standing behind the podium. But I'm glad to have the opportunity to spend a bit of time with you this morning. I've been asked to talk about the various roles that the U.S. Army found itself cast in when the battle stopped. When the battle stopped. Now, yeah. But that's all right. In my next paragraph, I'll say I asked Kelly to provide you with It's all right, Kelly. She'll do this throughout, interrupt. Say, and the next point is, now, my focus, of course, is going to be relatively narrow, the role that the Army found itself in. But you're in for, a genuine treat this afternoon. Dr. Ed Ayers, the President Emeritus at University of Richmond, will be in talking to you in general terms, really putting this together, this whole concept of what was Reconstruction anyway, because it meant a lot of different things to different people. And as I'll point out, it meant something different to the President of the United States, who we regard, based on our Constitution, as the Commander-in-Chief. And it meant something different to the people in Congress and to the Secretary of War and to General Ulysses S. Grant. More about that later. You do have copies of the charts. Of course, the way I printed them up, freed-up page, they're just pictures. You can't read anything. It's too little unless you have extraordinary eyesight. But if you want to take a note or two, that might facilitate just a little bit. This painting here, Alfred Woad. Anybody heard of Alfred Woad? He was an Englishman, talented illustrator. Would send his sketches back to the London Illustrated News and to Harper's Weekly and to other prominent news outlets here in the United States during the Civil War. If you Google Alfred Woad, you'll be amazed at the number of sketches and portraits and full-scale renderings of major battle sites in and around Virginia. They would, of course, when they received his work, his black and white, they would then engrave these or use them as woodcuts and then produce them. So he's a real source, Alfred Woad. I'm going to talk now sort of in chronological sense. From the time that Richmond fell, and of course, holy city on the James, regardless of where you come from, we always start with Richmond and we almost always end with Richmond. But let me call up a couple of photos that I know you've seen. As soon as Richmond fell, Matthew Brady and his field team of photographers, Alexander Gardner and others, descended upon Richmond, cameras at the ready, and smoke and ruins, of course, perfect photographic subjects. He made a photographic record that was immediately bought by news outlets and publishers all over the North, because, in fact, the fall of Richmond, that was a bigger deal. That's what they cause the church bells to ring in Boston and in Chicago and in New York. The fact that a week later Robert E. Lee surrendered the Army of Northern Virginia, well, that was interesting, but not as interesting to the man on the street on a street in Boston or New York or Chicago is a Fall of Richmond. That was a symbol. And so that's why he has so many photographs in the Library of Congress, for instance, in their collection, once again on the internet, available. But while Matthew Brady and his photographers were racing around town setting up their cameras, there was another visitor to Richmond, as you probably know, Abraham Lincoln. Had been down at City Point, today we call it Hopewell, near Petersburg, at General Grant's headquarters, where he was monitoring the last stages of the siege of Petersburg and was as encouraged as anyone when word came on the morning of the 3rd of April that, hey, the rebels are gone. We just marched into Petersburg. There's nobody around there but the civilians. The Confederates are gone. And so when he got that word that Petersburg had fallen, his assumption then was, well, Richmond must be in our hands as well. And sure enough, it was. Federal troops came in along what is today Route 5, then called the New Market Road, and were met by Mayor Mayo and the city fathers. Don't hurt us. We're destitute. Oh, and by the way, we have a city is on fire, and somebody let all the convicts out of the state pen, and they're running around. A real problem. So if you have an extra regiment or two, how about getting control of the prisoners from the penitentiary? In the midst of all of this, here comes the President of the United States. Notable, of course, for the fact that he was head and shoulders above everyone else in height, and then added to that with 14 inches of hat. And he walked from 17th and Dock Streets. He didn't have to worry about the flood wall then. They came ashore. And then he had a Navy flag officer, today we'd call him an admiral, a couple of sailors, half a dozen Marines. Now, if you know any Marines, they would tell you, that's all you need is 6 good Marines. But, consider the fact that there could have been some real bad boys here in Richmond. Well, it's him from the upper window. That didn't happen. He walked all the way up here to the executive mansion, sat down. It was a warm day, April the 4th, 1865. He asked for a glass of water. Later that afternoon, the military procured a carriage for him. He took a little drive around town. So President Lincoln was in town, but he wasn't the only federal officer in town. They were flooding in to the point that the one newspaper out of the 5 Richmond papers that were published during the Civil War, 5 Richmond papers? When I go out early in the morning to check my paper delivery box, I'm always pleasantly surprised when there's even one paper in there. That's the incredible Shrinking Times Dispatch. It's getting smaller and smaller. But they had 5. Now, toward the end of the war, they ran out of paper, newsprint. They were printing like single sheet, all the news is fit to print on a salvaged piece of wallpaper or something like that on the back. But the Whig did not get burned up in the fire. Its presses were still working. It managed to scrounge up enough paper so that it could publish this notice of all the different locations of key federal officers, federal Army officers, and if you had business with this general, that general, where to go to find them. Now, some of the people in Richmond just wanted to find out where they could get a little bit of food. And they knew that the Federal Army had food. They expected that, well, I'll probably be forced to take some oath of allegiance or something like that, say I've always been a true blue Yankee at heart, that sort of thing. If you're hungry enough, almost anyone was willing to do that. Others, though, people like Judge Campbell, members of the former Confederate government, they wanted to know where to reach federal officers so they could begin talking about the restoration of civil control, get the police force back on the street. Can you give us some help with our horse-drawn fire engines here for the Richmond Fire Department? Please help us because when the Confederate Army left, they took our horses with them, and that sort of thing. So here's an important announcement, all the different places. I'm going to point out one specific term here. Major Atherton Stevens, the Provost Marshal, has his residence in the home of the French consul, the French consulate. Provost Marshal, that's like the military cop. Okay, he wasn't a military policeman, MP as we know them today, but he was assigned as the Provost Marshal. French term meant he was in charge of discipline within the military, and with the dissolution of civil police forces and judges and courts throughout the South, more about this in a minute, the military provost marshals found themselves judge, jury, and they're thinking, what in my personal history as the clerk in my dad's dry goods store back in Columbus, Ohio, has equipped me for this? Let's see, we've got armed robbery down the street. There's a reported rape by a federal soldier who was reported to have violated this lady down outside of town. And then there are two people who are claiming that their goods were stolen and they're asking for compensation. These guys found themselves in a real jam, where they had to just rely on their best intentions, which were sometimes good and sometimes not so good. They were human. And people said, let me do this in my best Southern accent. We are so glad you're here. We've been waiting for you now for 4 years. And if you need any transportation, I still have 5 wagons I can lease to you if we can work a contract out in terms agreeable to the United States government, of which I've always been an admirer. And so these people were coming day and night. But there was another mission for the U.S. Army at the end of the war. This is a photo that you probably have seen as well. The Richmond Whig, once again, still really the single news outlet in Richmond at the time, in early May, had this article, Giving Burial to the Dead. The Battle of Gaines's Mill, fought in 1862, out near Mechanicsville in Hanover County. The battle was fought there. It was a massive fight. 27,000 Confederate soldiers. That's more than twice the number involved in Pickett's charge at Gettysburg. 27,000 Confederate soldiers attacked an almost equal number of Union soldiers there on the 27th of June, 1862. And then the war moved on. The war moved on. Was there any effort on the part of the good citizens of Richmond to go out there and locate the remains of a lot of dead Union troops laying there? No. No, they did send wagons out to pick up the thousands of dead Confederates and bring in the thousands of wounded Confederates to the 24 hospitals established here in Richmond. But the Union bodies just stayed there, laid there for 2 years, and then war came back again. The spring of '64, you had the big overland campaign directed now by the new 3-star general, the senior general in the Union Army, Ulysses S. Grant, directed George Meade to bring your Army of the Potomac. We'll move from Fredericksburg down toward Richmond, and we'll force Lee to come out and fight at every turn. Well, another massive battle takes place very close to Gaines's Mill in a place called Cold Harbor. And then Grant moved on. He left his dead and moved on. He crossed the James River at Flower Dew 100, and the siege of Petersburg opened. So after the war, the War Department, the Federal War Department, was given the mission of locating, disinterring from shallow graves, and then reinterring properly the remains of all the Union dead they could find. There are 5 federal cemeteries around Richmond. Seven Pines, Cold Harbor, there's one in Glendale, there's one on the Williamsburg Road. There are 5. and there's a huge one down near Petersburg at Poplar Grove. There are federal cemeteries from the Civil War all over Virginia, Fredericksburg, Winchester, and so forth. The units that ended up getting this mission were the United States Colored Troops, the USCT, because they were still on active duty after the war. Most of these units were not formed in the Federal Army until 1864. There were some magnificent units composed of African-American soldiers, like the 54th Massachusetts. We see it featured in the movie Glory. But that was a state organization. The United States Colored Troops was a federal organization, not allied with any particular northern state. So the USCT, which eventually was composed of 180,000 black men, who said, as Frederick Douglass proclaimed, let him once get upon him an eagle on his button, a U.S. on his buckle, bullets in his pocket, a musket on his shoulder. No one can deny him his right as a citizen. And so these men enlisted by the thousands, the tens of thousands, and beyond. But since they were still on active duty, they got the hard job of picking up these remains and burying them properly. Throughout the South, in the summer of 1865, you saw garrisons located in major southern cities. Here's a picture of a federal regiment, an infantry regiment, on parade. They were a presence, a visible presence. This is the strength of the United States Army. But as we know from our American history, one of the things that we Americans don't like to do in peacetime is maintain a big standing army. Been worried about that ever since the standing British army was sent here during colonial days and the Quartering Act was passed, and you'd be presented, if you were living in Boston or Baltimore or Norfolk, Virginia, with a writ that said, we will be quartering 3 soldiers here in your house. You can accommodate them, we're certain, because King George III says you can. So we didn't like to have a lot of standing troops during peacetime. So I'll talk about this in a second, the dissolution of the U.S. Army after the Civil War. But before that happened, the folks up in Washington, and this is sadly now in the aftermath of President Lincoln's awful assassination, they wanted to make certain that the former Confederates and people overseas understood that only a very strong republic could field an army of over 1 million men, which is the size of the U.S. Army at the end of the Civil War. And so they had 2 days of big parades in Washington in late May. The first day's parade, which took over 6 hours to complete, was William Tecumseh Sherman's Union Army called the Army of the Tennessee River. And on the reviewing stand on Pennsylvania Avenue was the current president, former vice president, Andrew Johnson, Edwin Stanton, the Secretary of War, who'd served Lincoln, and Ulysses Grant, the 3-star chief general. And Billy Sherman's bummers, as they call themselves, passed by. The next day, a much spiffier organization, George G. Meade's Army of the Potomac, mostly Eastern boys, they marched by. They kept step a little better. Their uniforms were a little trimmer, but it still took 6 hours. And newspaper people all over, from London, from Paris, from Potsdam, places like that, wrote about this massive army. But that wasn't all the Army was doing in the aftermath of the Civil War, because even while they were getting ready for the big parade, Phil Sheridan, Federal Cavalry commander, the man who had led the Federal forces into the Shenandoah Valley in the fall of '64, people in the Shenandoah Valley, do we have anyone here from the Shenandoah Valley? People in the Shenandoah Valley today, if you go to Stanton, Front Royal, Winchester, if you mention the term the burning, they know what you're talking about. You're talking about August and September of 1864. At that point, General Grant told Sheridan, I want you to travel through the Shenandoah Valley. I want you to clean it out so that even a crow flying over the Shenandoah Valley will have to take his own food with him for the rest of the season. And Sheridan did just that, because it was the breadbasket of the Confederacy. Sheridan and his subordinates, notable among them, his chief pyromaniac, George Armstrong Custer, his favorite expression when he saluted and waved his plumed hat is, "Watch for my smoke, General, watch for my smoke." And he had a lot more success burning up barns and mills and rustling cattle and taking horses and mules in the Shenandoah Valley than he did, well, about 12 years later, when he said, let's go get that bunch of pesky Sioux, you know. They're up there somewhere in Montana. Little Bighorn, I think, is where they're camped. Didn't work out. In any case, Sheridan is given 80,000 troops at the end of the war and sent out west of the Mississippi. He dropped off a few here and there where there's still some problems. You had this Confederate Cherokee chief, Stan Wadey, who was a brigadier general in the Confederate Army. He'd gone back into Oklahoma, and he was still fighting. You had Kirby Smith down in Texas. The last fight between the Confederate Army in Texas and the Union Army was a Confederate victory at Palomito Ranch in June of 1865. They won a significant battlefield victory and then said, okay, I guess the jig is up. We surrender now. But the problem that the reason Sheridan took 50,000 of his 80 into Texas really didn't have anything to do with Confederates at all directly. It was because in Mexico, just across the Rio Grande, here's a puppet who went by the term Maximilian. He and his consort, the very attractive Carlotta, had been established in Mexico by Napoleon III in France as a emperor, because you had Benito Juarez and the Juaristas in Mexico that were trying to find a way to have their own government. And they did not respond to Napoleon III's entreaties to have special trade relations and so forth. So Napoleon said, if you're going to be that way about it, I'm going to send the Foreign Legion, I'm going to send my friend Maximilian, and they'll set up their own government. Well, the U.S. had complained about this during the war, but not too vigorously, because they were afraid if they made too strong a complaint, Napoleon III might recognize the Confederacy, you see. And here was Confederate Texas and Arkansas and Louisiana, and just across the river, at that point, French-controlled Mexico. Well, the war's over now. They don't worry about what Napoleon III thinks, so here's a whole bunch of federal troops on the Rio Grande, and within a year, Maximilian's done for. Benito Juarez captures Maximilian, they execute him, and the French are gone. So it's a very active time right at the end of the Civil War. During the decade that follows, that's what we're going to be looking at here, the decade that follows, the U.S. Army will be conducting 3 major missions. One, the one that we see the movies about, opening the trails west, subduing the savage Native Americans. We call these the Indian campaigns. Number 2, when called upon by governors who had more than they could handle with incipient riots in the new industrial centers of the North, Detroit, Chicago, Columbus, Ohio, Boston, and so forth, federal troops would be sent in to gain control once again for the civil authorities. I guess the first action like this had occurred even before the Civil War was complete. In 1863, when the federal government passed the Draft Act, and all the Irish immigrants in New York City said, we're not going to go down south and fight. We just got here. Why are you going to draft us? And it was a It was a riot where over 150 people lost their lives, many of them African Americans who had found freedom in New York City. The Irish turned on them and said, "You're the cause for all this war. They're going to free you folks. You're going to come up from the deep south and take our jobs away." They had to send units directly, federal units, directly from the battlefield at Gettysburg to New York City to put down the draft riots, because it was way too much for the New York City Police Department to do. That still is a mission for the U.S. Army when called upon to do so. And the greatest challenge, the greatest trial of all, occupation duty in the South. That was the rough one. That was the one that the average U.S. Army officer was not happy with, didn't ask for it, but he got it. Here's a few points here about our Army, which I call the disappearing Army. In May of 1865, there were over 1 million men serving in the Army. And as we know now, there are even a few women serving in the U.S. Army, dressed as men, but that's a side point. Probably next year's subject. But over 1 million. But listen to this. By November of 1865, of those 1 million men, over 800,000 of them had received their last pay, had gotten speeches and salutes from the folks back home because they weren't regular Army soldiers. They weren't lifelong career soldiers. They were from Massachusetts. They were from Michigan. They were from Maine. They were from New Jersey. They were sent home. They were mustered out, was the term, mustered out, and they were veterans now. Okay? 800,000 out of 1 million. So only 200,000 left, and we know that almost half of them were down in Texas. Okay? Oh, yes, ma'am. The muster, M-U-S-T-E-R, is an old military term, a muster roll. And it means to count head by head by head. Used typically in militia units. Today we call them National Guard units. And it applied over time in Great Britain to any military organization when they said, okay, today we're going to count heads and make sure that everyone is getting paid to be in this unit actually is here. And that's the term, muster, okay? The muster out, muster rolls, all right? In the war, the overwhelming majority of federal troops were volunteers. They volunteered to fight the war, win the war, and go home. Well, after the war, there were only 11,000 of these volunteers left, and most of them were the U.S. CTs who had enlisted late in the war. So they still had time on their enlistment contract, which is typically for 3 years. Now, the large wartime Army, as I said, rapidly disbanded. Let's consider the size, then, of that Army to do those 3 missions I mentioned. Grant, thinking ahead to all the jobs the Army was going to have to do, asked Congress if we could increase the regular Army, which had only had less than 20,000 people in it at the time the Civil War broke out, spread all over the West, and little forts like Fort McHenry there in Baltimore, Fort Monroe down here in Hampton, Fort Sumter in Charleston Harbor, and a lot of them out west. He said, I need 80,000 to do the jobs that you've required of us as a minimum. But neither the Secretary of War, Stanton, or the Congress would support that. So in 1866, Congress voted on a peacetime establishment of just over 50,000, not the 80,000 that Grant said he needed. In 1869, Congress voted again. It's all tied to money, reduced the strength to 45,000. And then finally, 10 years after the war, the biggest cut comes. Congress authorized an active Army of 27,000 men. That's it. Nearly as small as it was before the Civil War. Because, look, where's the threat? Are those pesky Canadians going to attack us? I don't think so. What about the Mexicans? No, they're still trying to rebuild the country after their own Civil War between Juarez and the French. why do we need to maintain an army? And for those of you that have your copy of the U.S. Constitution, it's very, very clear that the Constitution gives the federal government the authority to raise and support armies, but no appropriation of money to that use shall be for longer term than 2 years. Now, the federal government is also authorized and directed to provide and maintain a navy. Okay. Naval threat, Royal Navy, Spanish Navy, French Navy, that's real. It's coming across the skyline, the horizon from some foreign country. But Army, why do you need a big Army? And so the Army gets smaller and smaller and smaller. Professor Russell Wagley, the late Professor Wagley at Temple University, wrote this magnificent book. It was published by the Macmillan series in 1973 and is still, in my view, one of the very best that you can find. It's called The American Way of War. It's available on Nook, Kindle, paperback, anywhere. The American Way of War by Russell Wagley, W-E-I-G-L-E-Y. And he makes the point that this is the American way of war. You build up for the fighting, and then you cut it down. And it doesn't really change. It doesn't really change. In 1945, toward the end of World War II, the Germans are ready to surrender. The Japanese are still a problem, but our force is getting closer and closer to the home islands of Japan. The Army Chief of Staff during World War II, George C. Marshall, who I have to point out, being a VMI grad, was VMI class of 1901. General Marshall had a requirement every other year to send a report to the Secretary of War and to Congress on the conduct of the war, that sort of thing. And here's what he wrote in his report in 1945 to Congress. All the constituents back home are saying, I really need a refrigerator. I really would like to have a car. Do we have to keep producing half-tracks and Jeeps? Who needs all these tanks? Here's what he writes to Congress. We Americans, have tried since the birth of our nation to promote our love of peace by a display of weakness. This course has failed us utterly, cost us millions of lives and billions of treasure. The reasons are quite understandable, said General Marshall. The world does not seriously regard the desires of the weak. Weakness presents too great a temptation to the strong, particularly to the bully who schemes for wealth and power. George C. Marshall. The world does not seriously regard the desires of the weak. Has that changed? That's 1945, and here we are. I don't think it's changed much. So he's saying, don't cut us too badly. Within 5 years, we know we don't have enough forces in the Pacific to even stop the North Korean army when it decides to roll across the 38th parallel and thoroughly decimate its neighbor, South Korea. It takes 3 years and a national mobilization to force the North Koreans back across the boundary that had been established for a communist North and a non-communist South. So the Army's getting smaller. There was one interesting aspect during Reconstruction times that I want to point out. You have these black veterans. A lot of them really don't have any home to go back to or any desire to go back there. What if you could use their expertise, their battlefield knowledge out west, where there's still one of the three big missions? The Army does. In 1866, in the Army Authorization Act, there were 4 regiments formed, special regiments: the 24th and 25th Infantry Regiments and the 9th and 10th Cavalry Regiments. These would be all black soldiers. They'll have white officers, And over time, more and more young black officers will come into positions of authority within these regiments. I think it's interesting that the first black graduate of West Point, Henry O. Flipper, a Georgia native, as soon as he graduates, he gets a little leave, and then he packs his bags and heads west, where he will become a troop leader in the 10th U.S. Cavalry. Back in 1992, General Colin Powell, then chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, came out to Fort Leavenworth, where I was serving, and we had a marvelous event there, the establishment of this magnificent equestrian statue in honor of the men that their Indian adversaries came to call the Buffalo Soldiers. The Buffalo Soldiers. And here's a cavalryman on his horse out west, in memory of and celebration of the service of the Buffalo Soldiers. They didn't just open the pathway west. They served in Cuba. When Teddy Roosevelt and his Rough Riders went up San Juan Hill, actually Kettle Hill, but San Juan Hill, who was right beside them? The 10th Cavalry and the 24th Infantry. Black soldiers moving up that hill. That's when one of the curious events of the Spanish-American War took place, because they had an old Confederate who had been commissioned as a general of volunteers for the Spanish-American War, old General Wheeler. There's a famous photo of General Wheeler standing there, a little white beard, small person. Off to one side is, with his round glasses, Colonel Teddy Roosevelt of the Rough Riders. And they were going up the hill together, and Wheeler, I guess, got overly excited. You know, halfway up the San Juan Hill, he whips off his hat and yells, "Come on, boys, we've got the damn Yankees on the run." The Spanish guys were saying, "Hey, I've been all I could be. I'm out of here." And they were gone. But right side by side, here's the Buffalo Soldiers and Teddy Roosevelt's Rough Riders up the hill together. When we talk about the Army and Reconstruction, the questions about slavery, state sovereignty, the biggest issue was, how do we restore normalcy? Well, the armies, mentioned, had a principal role in that. And even before the war ended, as they moved into areas of the South where civil control had broken down, just as it had here in Richmond, the Army found itself, with the provost marshals usually, doing everything from establishing regulations for trash pickup, for who gets locked up for misbehaving overnight. How do you determine the loyalty of people that say, I'd like to be a sheriff's deputy, indeed I would. Was he a former Confederate, or was he a Unionist? You know, in some areas like East Tennessee, there were far more people who were loyal to the Union throughout the war than there were red-hot Confederates who wanted to go off and fight in a gray uniform. Western North Carolina, same way. All right, from Charlotte west, I mean, you had the Sons of Liberty up there, and they were Unionists through and through. So you had all these issues. And then came a new organization altogether. Close to the end of the war, 1865, late in the year, Congress created the Bureau of Refugees, Freedmen, and Abandoned Lands. We call it the Freedmen's Bureau. It put the Freedmen's Bureau under the control, looking around in the presidential cabinet, who controls the Freedmen's Bureau? Well, the War Department is really the only department that has any particular sway in the South just now. So they put the Freedmen's Bureau under the War Department. And typically, the people leading the Freedmen's Bureau were commissioned Army officers. But the Bureau was led by General Oliver Otis Howard, from a strong abolitionist family in New England. One-armed Oliver Otis Howard lost his arm right out here by the Richmond Airport in 1862. Later would help found Howard University in Washington, D.C. So Howard is commanding the Freedmen's Bureau, but he's getting his orders for the Freedmen's Bureau directly from the President's office, not so much from the War Department per se, not from Secretary of War Stanton or from General Grant. So it was a part of the Department of War, but not really under direct Army control. When Johnson took over after Lincoln's assassination, he proceeded in his own idea of what a Reconstruction could look like. And he's an interesting guy, Andrew Johnson. Very poor background, trained as a tailor, a Republican from East Tennessee. He's a senator when Tennessee leaves the Union in 1861, but he doesn't leave. He doesn't resign. He says, I'm staying. I support the Union. And by 1864, they're thinking up there in Washington, who should we run as vice president for Abe Lincoln in his second term? They said, thank you very much for your interest in national defense to Hamilton Hamlin, sent him home to Maine, and they ran this Southerner, Andrew Johnson, on Lincoln's ticket. And they, of course, they won resoundingly. Now he finds himself in a position he never dreamed he'd be in. He's the president. He's the man. He's got to deal with it. Well, he's a Unionist, but he's still a Southerner with all the biases built in to white Southerners at that point. So he's not really too interested in some of the actions that the radical Republicans in Congress are urging. You know, let's give the vote right now to all these former slaves. And he also said, you know, almost anybody that had any control in the South in the last 4 years was a Confederate. Now, they didn't have little membership cards, you know, but they were Confederates. And he said, let's give them amnesty right away if they'll take an oath of allegiance, and then they can be reelected as mayor, and they can fill their state legislatures, and they can be seated here in Washington. Yeah, that'll be fine. We get everyone back together. We all hold hands. I don't think Kumbaya had come out just yet, but if it had, I don't know, maybe with a mandolin, a banjo, and some Tennessee picking, you might have tried that, but it wasn't going to work because the people in Congress said, no, we've been fighting for 4 years against these traitors, these treasonous vipers. No, we're not going to seat them in Congress. Send all the people you want from Virginia, Georgia, South Carolina. You're not sitting in Congress again. We're only going to have loyal men in Congress. And so during Reconstruction, you had a lot of historians refer to presidential Reconstruction, which eventually would lead to his removal or attempted removal. He was saved by one vote through impeachment by the Congress. It was the Congress that took over Reconstruction in 1867. That leniency, in fact, was going to be the biggest problem that Andrew Johnson faced. And so when we look at the congressional actions, when they said, no, we're in charge of what's going on, there are a number of them. And I've listed some here. The Civil Rights Act of 1866 established black Americans as citizens of this country and forbade discrimination against them. And a few months later, Congress submitted to the various states the 14th Amendment to the Constitution, specified that no state should deprive any person of life, liberty, or property without due process of law. And then the Congress asserted supremacy in a whole series of legislative acts. The basic plan is the Command of the Army Act, which is part of Army Appropriations of 1867, to handle problems that had arisen in the South. Chief among them, of course, being convincing white Southerners that, hey, slavery is gone. Yeah, no more. Then, in rapid succession, followed the Tenure of Office Act and the first Reconstruction Act. That Tenure of Office Act denied the President of the United States, this is Congress versus the President, the right, the authority to remove any cabinet officer without Senate approval. You see what they're doing here from Andrew Johnson, who they did not trust, they being Republicans in Congress. They're removing all of his chief authority. Then the Tenure of Office Act was passed to ensure that Secretary of War Edwin Stanton would remain as the Secretary of War because he firmly believed, as did Congress, that the South needed to be punished for their misdeeds. And when Johnson tried to suspend Secretary Stanton from office, Congress said, no, you can't do that without our approval. Then, of course, there were Reconstruction Acts. And this is the event that changed everything in the South, because you took civil authority away from the old order, the Democrats. You created a Southern Republican power base, and you divided the South into military districts, each of them commanded by a two-star federal general. Okay, the military districts. And this, of course, created that biggest issue about civilian control of the military. Because now you have a situation where you got a general with two stars on his shoulder here and here, and he's told, don't respond to any directives that you get from on White House stationery. Only to what you get from this office, General of the Army Ulysses S. Grant. Just disregard. So this is something a lot of people don't really understand, how close in the years right after the Civil War, this nation came to become a military bureaucracy running the country. Very close. The Third Reconstruction Act is another one that said no district commander shall be bound in his action by any opinion of any civil officer of the United States. So it got an even tighter control over those generals down south. You better check with us here at the War Department on anything that you get by way of new definitive guidance. We've got to underscore this and say, yes, we agree. We agree. Now, this Reconstruction mission absorbed about a third of the strength on an average year of this smaller army. And as fewer and fewer troops were there to respond to emergencies. You got a big riot downtown, come quick, trying to have a new election for sheriff. The Republican is hiding in the jail because you've got all these ex-Confederates raising hell downtown. Come quick, send troops. Well, what's going to happen? Well, we don't have any troops. They moved out last week. Now, we do have this new militia that we formed here. They're mostly black guys. They haven't had any military training. We could send them, and who are they going to go up against? The local, newly formed militias, local militia. They're going to go up against men that fought with Nathan Bedford Forrest, Robert E. Lee, Stonewall Jackson. They may be wearing bib overalls now, but they learned how to fight at Gettysburg and Shiloh and places like that. It's not an even contest. And so what you see, the growth of, is what some people call the invisible empire. Mm-hmm. The Ku Klux Klan, post-war organization, had a considerable number of members by 1870-71. That was a special concern to the U.S. Army. And of course, Congress was deeply concerned about it as well, because the Klan was employing terrorist tactics. They could call themselves different things, the Knights of the White Camellia or the Rifle Clubs, But they were terrorists. They rode at night. They covered their faces. They burned crosses. Sometimes they burned homes. Sometimes they burned people. the Klan. So one of the most important Army functions with reduced strength was the responsibility to back up the state militia forces, ill-equipped, largely untrained, and the Army was not successful in doing this. With every passing year after 1870, fewer and fewer U.S. troops were present in the South, the former Confederacy. Stronger and stronger became these sub-rosa organizations. So when, as an example, the Republican governor who'd been elected in the 1860s called for General Grant, asked Grant to send federal troops, please, from outside South Carolina to help us put down a major riot here near Charleston. In doing so, when a trainload of federal troops did arrive from the Washington, D.C. area, the riot was done, but the symbol was great. This guy Chamberlain, who'd been fairly well thought of by the locals, he was fair, he was honest, he was unimpeachable, but he was no longer electable. And on the next gubernatorial election in South Carolina, he was thrown out of office, and General Wade Hampton, a Confederate general of great note from South Carolina, was elected as governor of South Carolina, a Democrat through and through. Later, he would serve as a U.S. senator from South Carolina. And this is a story that was repeated over and over in the South as we moved out of the first 5 years of Reconstruction into the 1870s. You would find cases like William Oates, the Confederate colonel who had assaulted a little round top at Gettysburg 5 times with his regiment, the 15th Alabama, serving as governor of Alabama. You would find John B. Gordon, who led Lee's troops through the surrender at Appomattox, later serving as governor of Georgia, and then U.S. senator from Georgia. And certainly that was true here in Virginia as well. Fitzhugh Lee, Robert E. Lee's nephew, would serve as governor of Virginia. So these old Confederates were coming back into power, and life got harder and harder in the 1870s for black people in the South. And so with the end of Congressional Reconstruction, the Army's direct supervision of civil affairs came to an end, and the number of occupation troops were really reduced down to practically nothing. And so now the Army's mission was just try to protect African Americans and preserve the state governments, and in truth, they weren't very successful at that because there was no support among white Southerners for continued Republican rule in the South. In April 1877, the final act of the Army in Reconstruction played out, because in the election of 1876, Rutherford B. Hayes, a Republican, good war record, Ohio governor, was the Republican candidate for president, and then you had Samuel Tilden from the Northeast as a Democrat. And when all the votes were counted, looked like Hayes, the Republican, had more electoral votes than Tilden, the Democrat, but then Tilden had a larger popular vote. And so in that case, Congress was asked to decide who's going to be the next president. Well, they gave the mission to Congress, and they based it on representation in Congress. And so you had 8 Republicans from Congress and 7 Democrats from Congress on this 15-man commission. Didn't look like they were going to be able to come up with a solution until Republicans talked to their Democratic colleagues and said, surely men of goodwill can reason together. What if we promise to put some Democrats in Rutherford B. Hayes's cabinet? And what if, let's see, some of the other deals. what if we insisted that President Hayes remove the last federal troops from the Deep South, down in Louisiana and South Carolina, within 6 months after his taking office? Would that make a difference to you? And that was enough to convince the Democrats to stop stonewalling against Hayes being installed. And so after some delay, he did take the oath as the President of the United States and would serve a term from 1877 to 1881 as President of the United States. But that meant the last of the federal troops were gone. By 1877, there were no federal U.S. troops left in the South. There were some state militias, but no federal U.S. troops. They were all back to what they were doing before the war, supporting white incursions into Native American lands in the West, helping the white settlers move west, guarding our ports and those facilities. Up at the Army Center of Military History in Washington at Fort McNair, they've been very busy up there over the last 10 years, producing a series of monographs about the Army during the Civil War. And the last of those monographs came out late last year. It's authored by a very fine historian, Army historian, called The Army and Reconstruction, 1865-1877. Every one of these monographs, which is, I don't know, in this case 70 pages long, every one of them is available on the U.S. Army Center of Military History website. You can download it as a PDF, print it out, and so forth. It's there for you. But Mark, in his concluding page in his monograph, quotes a federal officer, a war hero, who had been sent south to serve as one of those military district commanders. Nelson Miles, who would later have a brilliant career in the West and then subsequently in the Philippine Islands following the Spanish-American War. I'll let you read what Mark has written there. Notice what he says. The Army's traditional aversion to politics hadn't changed that much. Dwight David Eisenhower had never voted in a presidential election before he ran as president, you know. A lot of Army officers, George C. Marshall never voted in a federal election. He didn't think it was appropriate for those officers who would have to carry out the mission assigned by any commander-in-chief, Democrat, Republican, whatever, to be voting one way or the other. That's changed somewhat, but among active duty Army officers, there's still an attempt to remain apolitical. But you see what Miles has said. Civil affairs, controversies, race prejudice, just let me get back out there where all I have to deal with is Sitting Bull and his Sioux, you know, and I just be a soldier again. Back to a simple life. The roles of the Army in civil relations, domestic and foreign, has continued to challenge the military and its civilian leaders in the White House, the Cabinet, and in the Congress, of course. The lessons that the Army could have, should have, would have learned in this period during Reconstruction, they would have to learn and then relearn again after every major conflict. Spanish-American War, we had troops that were expecting to march into Manila, and all the Filipinos would say, hey, we've been waiting on you. Thank you for getting here, kicking those Spaniards out. What they actually said is, hey, get rid of the Spaniards, and then you leave on the next boat. We want to control the Philippines. And so you had the Philippine insurrection. A lot of the military leaders of the 20th century, as young officers like George Marshall and Douglas MacArthur, found themselves learning their trade in the jungles of Mindanao and Luzon, fighting some very, very tough insurgents, insurrectos, down there in the Philippine Islands. Difficult. And then, of course, you had a situation after November the 11th, 1918, armistice in Western Europe. Most Americans at completely unaware of the fact that we had 3 Army divisions in the Rhineland, along the Rhine, Cologne, in 1919 to 1923, before we finally withdrew them. That was as all these different treaties were being signed, Versailles, Trianon, all those different World War I treaties. We kept U.S. Army troops right there in Germany. And then, of course, after World War II, it was right back there again, dealing with civil situations. Sergeant Henry Kissinger, born in Germany of a Jewish family. Now he's a U.S. Army sergeant down in Bad Tolz in the Tyrol, in the Tyrolean Alps. He's in charge of everything in town. He's a sergeant, 3 stripes. Mayor Kissinger. Actually, he did pretty well. It helped that he could speak German. And it also helped that the Germans in that area were pretty well convinced that they had really lucked out, because they didn't have a big enough city to be bombed flat by the U.S. Army Air Forces like Schweinfurt or Hamburg or Dresden. They were just pretty much, yodeling and skiing and things like that down in the Alps. And then, most recently, of course, as we know, Iraq, 2003. It was the vice president that said, "Oh, we'll be welcomed as not conquerors, but as heroes." For those of us that had close friends who found themselves in Baghdad, in Sadr City, in Mosul, in Fallujah, for the years that followed our very successful advance into Iraq in 2003, dealing with people who were from different tribes in Iraq, it wasn't successful. They would have understood exactly what Nelson Miles was talking about. Let me get out of the green zone. Let me go back to Fort Hood. I'd like to attack something with a whole company of M1 tanks instead of dealing with these different tribal entities here in downtown Baghdad. I'd just like to conclude now by mentioning that today, up in Carlisle, Pennsylvania, at the U.S. Army War College, Army officers, men and women who are mostly lieutenant colonels, done pretty well in their career up to that point, or they wouldn't be students at the Army War College, are thinking about the world we live in. They find an acronym, always an acronym in the Army, VUCA, VUCA. The world is a VUCA place. Volatile, uncertain, complex, and ambiguous. VUCA. I'm saying Virginia in the 1870s was a volatile, uncertain, complex, and ambiguous place that Army officers did their best to deal with. But like Nelson Miles, they were ever so glad just to go back to soldiering once again. Thanks very much.